Melissa mentioned Trevor's name so casually, like he was just another coworker, but I caught the way her voice wavered ever so slightly. She was sitting at the kitchen table, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "It's just a harmless dinner," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. I was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. Her words hung in the air between us. I wanted to press her, to ask why this dinner couldn't wait until the next office lunch or why it had to be him. But instead, I let out a slow breath and kept my voice steady. "Do whatever makes you happy," I said, shrugging like it didn't matter. The way her shoulders relaxed told me I'd said the right thing, the thing she wanted to hear. But her relief was short-lived. I could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt? Hesitation? Maybe she expected me to fight her on this, to argue or ask more questions. Instead, I stayed calm, my expression unreadable. That night, she took her time getting ready. I sat on the couch, pretending to scroll through my phone while she flitted around the house. The sound of her heels clicking on the hardwood floor echoed through the living room. She'd put on a dress I didn't recognize, a little black number that hugged her figure in all the right ways. Her makeup was subtle, but she looked stunning. Too stunning for what she claimed was just dinner. "You look nice," I said, keeping my tone even. "Thanks," she replied quickly, glancing at me but not lingering. She grabbed her purse, her hand trembling just enough for me to notice. Then, she stopped at the door and turned back. For a split second, I thought she might say something. An apology, an excuse, anything. Instead, she just smiled. "Don't wait up." The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence of the house swallowed me whole. I sat there for a moment, staring at the spot where she'd stood. The living room felt colder somehow, emptier. My eyes drifted to the wedding photo on the mantel, the one we'd had framed and hung as a reminder of our vows. Her smile in that picture was so genuine, so full of love. Now, it felt like I was looking at a stranger. I reached for the whiskey bottle I kept tucked away behind the glasses. As I poured myself a drink, my mind started piecing together a plan. I wasn't going to yell or cry or beg her to stay. Melissa thought she knew me, thought I was predictable, but tonight, I'd show her a side of me she'd never seen. By the time the ice in my glass had melted, my decision was made. She wanted freedom? Fine. But freedom always comes with a price. The door clicked shut, and I sat in the silence, staring at the wedding photo on the mantel. Melissa thought I'd spend the evening sulking, waiting for her to come home. She didn't know me as well as she thought. I stood and walked to the bedroom, pulling out a suitcase, the one we'd bought for our honeymoon in Greece, back when things were good. Opening her side of the closet, I began packing. Dresses, shoes, the silk robe she loved, everything went into the suitcase. I didn't rush. My movements were steady, deliberate. Afterward, I grabbed a few moving boxes from the garage. I packed her toiletries, her jewelry, even the knickknacks she'd scattered around the house. The scented candles, the framed photos with her friends, everything that screamed Melissa. When I finished, the house felt lighter, quieter, almost peaceful. Grabbing my phone, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Larry, a locksmith I'd hired years ago. "Larry, it's Ryan Miller. I need the locks changed tonight. How soon can you get here?" "Tonight? That's short notice," he said, pausing. "But for you, I'll be there in an hour." "Perfect." While waiting, I started drafting a note. It had to be short, clear, and leave no room for interpretation. Melissa wanted freedom? Fine, but she'd have to deal with the fallout. When Larry arrived, I let him in and showed him the doors. He glanced at the packed boxes but didn't ask questions. He probably saw this sort of thing often. Within an hour, the locks were replaced, and I handed him cash before locking up behind him. I left the new keys for Melissa in the kitchen, next to a folded note that read, "Freedom has a cost. Your things are at Unit 12, West Storage. Good luck." Finally, I tossed my old house keys, the ones Melissa carried, into the trash. She wouldn't need them anymore. By midnight, I was back on the couch, whiskey in hand, watching the street outside. My phone buzzed on the table, but I didn't bother picking it up. I already knew who it was. While Melissa was out laughing over drinks with Trevor, I wasn't sitting idle. If she thought I'd let her betray me without consequences, she was sorely mistaken. Earlier that week, I'd prepared for this moment. I'd hired a private investigator. Someone discreet, professional, and thorough. Tonight, he was tailing Melissa and Trevor. By now, he'd likely captured everything I needed. Photos, timestamps, and proof of what her harmless dinner truly entailed. I poured another glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the dim light of the living room. My laptop sat open on the coffee table, displaying the investigator's updates in real time. It didn't take long before his messages started coming through. 9:45 p.m. Arrived at Bistro 88. Holding hands at the table. She's leaning in close. 10:15 p.m. Whispering across the table, laughing. His hand is on her leg. I stared at the screen, the calm in my chest hardening into something colder. I wasn't surprised. If anything, it was validating. The proof was exactly what I needed to take the next step. Trevor wasn't the only one with someone waiting at home. I opened my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found Emma's number, Trevor's wife. We'd only met once, at some corporate event Melissa had dragged me to. She seemed kind, the type who didn't deserve this. Typing a brief message, I attached the clearest photo from the investigator and hit send. You deserve to know where your husband is tonight. Bistro 88. Table 12. The response came quicker than I expected. Who is this? What are you talking about? I didn't bother replying. The image spoke for itself. Minutes later, another update came through from the investigator. 10:40 p.m. A woman just entered the restaurant. Looks furious. Approaching their table now. I set my glass down and leaned back, imagining the scene. Emma storming through the doors, her anger drawing every pair of eyes in the room. Melissa freezing mid-laugh, her cheeks burning with humiliation as Emma confronted Trevor. I could picture the chaos, Emma's voice cutting through the low hum of conversations, drinks spilling, the other diners whispering. Melissa always hated being the center of attention unless it was on her terms. And Trevor? He'd probably sit there stunned, stammering out excuses that no one would believe. The investigator's final message for the night confirmed it. 10:50 p.m. Scene caused. Woman left in a hurry. Target and companion look shaken. Leaving soon. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet, the satisfaction settling over me like a heavy blanket. Melissa thought she was playing a private game, but now, her actions were out in the open. Let her try to explain this away. It was just past midnight when Melissa's car pulled into the driveway. I sat in the darkened living room, the empty whiskey glass on the coffee table beside me. The house was silent, charged with the weight of everything I'd set in motion. Through the window, I watched as the headlights went dark. The sound of her car door closing echoed faintly, followed by the click of her heels on the driveway. She approached the front door, confident, likely rehearsing the casual explanation she'd offer if I were awake. Click, click. The lock didn't budge. I heard her try again, the metallic rattle turning into a steady jiggle as confusion crept in. She muttered something under her breath and leaned into the door, pressing her weight against it as if that might help. Then came the knocking, firm but restrained at first. "Ryan," she called, her voice muffled through the door. I didn't move. She knocked again, louder this time, frustration creeping into her tone. "Ryan, what's going on? Open the door." I stayed where I was, my face calm as I stared at the shadows her movements cast on the curtains. The pounding started, her fists slamming against the door now. "Ryan, this isn't funny. Open up." Still nothing from me. The silence between her shouts grew heavier, and I could imagine the thoughts racing through her mind. Confusion would give way to panic soon enough. Finally, her pounding stopped. Through the narrow slit in the curtains, I saw her step back, scanning the porch. That's when she spotted the note taped to the door, fluttering slightly in the cool night breeze. She ripped it off, her hands trembling as she read the words. "Freedom has a cost. Your things are at Unit 12, West Storage. Good luck." Her knees buckled, and she dropped onto the porch steps, the paper slipping from her hands. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at nothing, her breathing uneven. Then the tears started. I watched as she fumbled for her phone, tapping the screen quickly and bringing it to her ear. I didn't need to see to know who she was calling. What she didn't know was that I'd already blocked her number. Her face twisted in frustration when the call failed to connect. She tried again, and again, each attempt more frantic than the last. By the fourth try, she let out a scream of frustration and threw the phone onto the concrete. The clatter broke the night silence as much as her sobs did. Melissa curled into herself, her hands clutching her hair, rocking slightly as though trying to steady the chaos. I sat in the shadows, unmoving, detached. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. What I felt was a clarity so sharp it cut through everything else. She had wanted her freedom. She'd taken it tonight, laughing and flirting with Trevor. Now, I was simply giving her what she'd chosen. After a while, she stood shakily, picking up the crumpled note. Her movements were slow, her shoulders slumped under the weight of what she now understood. She walked back to her car, her heels dragging against the pavement, and sat inside, motionless, before finally driving away. Only then did I exhale. Melissa thought she could come home and pretend nothing had happened, that everything could go back to normal. But betrayal doesn't allow for normal. Not for her, and not for me. The night after Melissa left felt like the first calm in a long storm. I stayed seated on the couch for hours, staring out at the empty street, the weight of what I'd done settling over me. There was no regret, no second-guessing, just a strange sense of peace. The next morning, I woke early, the faint glow of sunrise creeping through the curtains. The house felt different, lighter. It wasn't just the absence of her things. It was the absence of all the tension, the excuses, the unease that had slowly crept into our lives. I walked through the now emptied spaces of our home. Her clothes were gone from the closet, her toiletries cleared out of the bathroom, her favorite mug missing from the kitchen counter. It was as though she had never lived here at all, and I found comfort in the quiet. Still, there were practical matters to address. I had to notify the bank to remove her from the accounts, change the passwords to the streaming services she still used, and let our mutual friends know, carefully, that Melissa and I were no longer a unit. I'd expected to feel more anger or sadness while cutting these ties, but it was oddly liberating. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message from the investigator came through with more details about last night's confrontation at Bistro 88. She left shortly after Trevor's wife confronted them. They didn't stay together. I have the footage. Let me know if you want more. I stared at the message for a moment, considering. The photos he'd sent earlier were damning enough, but knowing that Trevor and Melissa had been publicly humiliated was its own kind of justice. For now, I didn't need to see more. Instead, I grabbed my coffee and sat at the dining table, letting my thoughts settle. Melissa was out there now, dealing with the fallout of her choices. She'd find the storage unit. Eventually. She'd see the life I'd packed up for her, reduced to a few boxes and a suitcase. A part of me wondered how she'd explain all of this to her friends, to her family. Would she spin it as a misunderstanding? Blame me for overreacting? Or would she finally have to face the reality of what she'd done? By the afternoon, I decided it was time to reclaim more than just my house. I drove to a hardware store and picked up paint and supplies. The living room walls had been a soft beige Melissa insisted on when we moved in. It was time for a change. I spent the rest of the day painting. The fresh coat of deep gray covered the memories of a shared life, replacing them with something that felt wholly mine. By the time I finished, the room looked brand new, unrecognizable, a fitting reflection of the new chapter one was beginning. As the evening crept in, I sat back on the couch, sipping a glass of water instead of whiskey this time. The phone sat silent beside me. Melissa hadn't tried to contact me again, and I doubted she ever would. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to fall apart. Instead, I felt like I was finally putting the pieces of my life back together, one quiet, deliberate step at a time. The following day, the texts and calls began. Not from Melissa, she'd gone silent, probably still reeling from the locked door and the note. No, these were from mutual friends and acquaintances, people who'd caught wind of something unusual. The first call came mid-morning. It was Jake, a friend of ours from college. "Hey man," he started, his tone casual but curious. "I heard Melissa didn't come home last night. Everything okay?" I kept my response measured. "Yeah, everything's fine. She's sorting some things out right now." A long pause followed. I could tell he wanted to press but decided against it. "Well, let me know if you need anything." After hanging up, I realized Jake wouldn't be the last. Melissa had always been social, always quick to post updates on her life. Her silence now would be noticeable, and people would start asking questions. Sure enough, more messages trickled in throughout the day. A coworker of hers texted me, "Melissa wasn't at work today. Is she okay?" A neighbor asked, "I saw a moving truck last night. Are you two going somewhere?" I kept my replies short, careful not to give too much away. The last thing I wanted was to fuel gossip, especially when I knew Melissa would be scrambling to regain control of the narrative. By late afternoon, the inevitable happened. Her sister, Claire, called. Claire was fiercely loyal to Melissa, but she wasn't oblivious. "Ryan," she said after a brief greeting, "what's going on?" "Melissa called me last night, crying, but she wouldn't say why." I hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "Claire," I said slowly, "you might want to ask Melissa about that." She didn't take the bait. "I'm asking you," she said firmly. I sighed. "Melissa made some choices," I said, keeping my tone even. "She's dealing with the consequences. That's all I can say." Another pause. "Does this have to do with Trevor?" Her question caught me off guard, but I recovered quickly. "Why would you ask that?" "She mentioned him a lot the last time we talked," Claire admitted. "Something about grabbing dinner and how you didn't mind." I thought it was weird at the time. I didn't confirm or deny it, letting the silence speak for itself. Claire exhaled sharply. "I'll talk to her," she said finally. "But, Ryan, are you okay?" The question threw me. For all her loyalty to Melissa, Claire sounded genuine. "I will be," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. By evening, the buzz had died down, and the house was quiet again. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, rereading the messages and replaying the calls in my mind. The truth was out there now, spreading in whispers and half-formed suspicions. Melissa would have to face it eventually. She could run from the questions, dodge the calls, and avoid her friends, but the weight of her choices would catch up with her. As for me, I wasn't hiding or running. I was done waiting for things to fall apart. The pieces had already shattered, and I was finally learning to live without them. 2 days passed in relative quiet, the kind that felt both unsettling and necessary. I spent the time reclaiming my space, organizing, cleaning, making the house feel like mine again. The silence was a stark contrast to the usual background noise of Melissa's presence, but I didn't miss it. Then came a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I hesitated, wondering if Melissa had returned. But when I opened it, I was met with someone else entirely. Emma, Trevor's wife. She stood there, her expression a mix of anger and exhaustion, clutching a manila envelope in one hand. "Ryan," she said curtly, "we need to talk." I opened the door wider and gestured for her to come in. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside with a purposeful stride. Her presence filled the space in a way that was both commanding and heavy with unspoken tension. We sat at the dining table, and she placed the envelope in front of me. "I know you sent me those photos," she said, her voice steady but low. I didn't bother denying it. "You deserved to know." She nodded, her jaw tightening. "And now, I think you deserve to know this." She slid the envelope across the table. Inside were printed screenshots of text messages. Pages of them. They were from Melissa to Trevor and vice versa. I skimmed through them, the words cutting deeper with each line. Flirty exchanges, private jokes, complaints about me, plans to meet up. "They've been at this for months," Emma said bitterly. "It wasn't just dinner, Ryan. It was trips, secret meetings, nights at hotels. She told him things about you, personal things, like it was some kind of game for them." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let it show. I looked up at her, keeping my expression neutral. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I thought you'd want to know the full story," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And because I'm not letting Trevor get away with this." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've already filed for divorce. He's trying to play the victim, saying it was all a misunderstanding, but I'm done. I thought you should see what kind of person you've been married to." I set the papers down, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Thank you for this," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Emma leaned back in her chair, studying me. You're calmer than I expected, she said, almost suspiciously. Calm is all I've got left, I replied. She gave a bitter laugh. Well, you're handling it better than me. I've spent the last 2 days crying, yelling, and breaking things. And honestly, I'm still not done. I managed a faint smile. Everyone handles betrayal differently. Emma stood, smoothing her hands over her jacket. I should go. I just thought you deserved the truth. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry you're in this mess too. I walked her to the door, pausing as she turned to leave. Emma, I said, if you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. She nodded, her expression softening just slightly. Same goes for you. As I closed the door behind her, I stood in the silence, the weight of the envelope in my hand. I should have been angry or devastated, but instead, I felt something unexpected, validation. Melissa and Trevor had dug their own graves. Now, it was just a matter of letting them fall into them. The day after Emma's visit, I was in the garage, working on a DIY workbench to keep my hands busy. The rhythmic sanding helped calm my thoughts. Then I heard it. Melissa's car pulling into the driveway. I didn't rush to the door. I finished sanding the plank in my hands, wiped the dust from my shirt, and headed inside. By the time I reached the living room, she was pounding on the door. Ryan! I know you're in there, she shouted, her voice sharp and raw. I unlocked the door and opened it, leaning casually against the frame. Melissa stood there, disheveled, her eyes red and puffy. Her usual polished image was gone. What do you want, Melissa? I asked, my tone calm. She tried stepping forward, but I didn't move. Can we talk? She said quickly. This is ridiculous. Talk about what? I asked, folding my arms. About us, she said, her voice cracking. About whatever it is you're doing. I let out a dry laugh. What I'm doing? Melissa, this is all because of your choices. Her lips quivered, and she shook her head. I made a mistake, okay? But locking me out, packing my stuff, that's too far. Too far. I said, raising an eyebrow. Was sneaking around with Trevor too far? Lying to my face? She flinched, her gaze falling. I didn't mean for it to get this bad, she muttered. But it did, I replied coldly. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up. Ryan, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking. But we've been through so much. Don't throw it all away. You didn't think about us then, I said flatly. Why should I believe you now? Her tears spilled over. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Please, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, anything. Just let me come home. For a moment, I stood there, watching her unravel. Then I thought of the evidence, the lies, the betrayal that had gone on for months. You made your choice, Melissa, I said firmly. And now I've made mine. Her face crumpled. You can't mean that, she whispered. I do. We're done. Melissa stared at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. I closed the door and locked it. This time, there was no anger or sadness, just the quiet satisfaction of finally being in control. After Melissa's visit, I expected her to leave things alone for a while, but I underestimated her determination. By the next morning, I started receiving calls and texts from mutual friends and even her family. The first message came from Jake. Hey man, I just talked to Melissa. She says you locked her out? What's going on? I stared at the message, debating whether to respond. Melissa was clearly trying to spin the narrative, casting herself as the victim. I typed back. Jake, it's complicated. Melissa knows why. I'd rather not get into it. His reply came quickly. Okay. Just know I'm here if you need anything. It wasn't just Jake. By the afternoon, I had 2 missed calls from Claire, her sister. I wasn't in the mood to explain myself but decided it was better to answer her than leave her in the dark. Ryan, Claire said when I picked up. Her tone was clipped, more annoyed than concerned. What's going on? Melissa told me you kicked her out and won't talk to her. She's a mess. I let her vent for a moment before cutting in. Claire, did Melissa tell you why she's not here anymore? The pause on the other end was telling. She said you're upset about Trevor. But I don't think it's what you think. I laughed dryly. It's exactly what I think. I've seen the messages, Claire. I know about the dinners, the hotels, and the lies. Claire inhaled sharply. She told me it wasn't serious. That it didn't mean anything. It meant enough for her to betray me, I said firmly. She made her choices. Now I'm making mine. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, I'll talk to her. I didn't realize it was this bad. After the call ended, I sat at the dining table, staring out the window. The fallout was spreading, and I wasn't sure where it would end. Later that evening, I got another message. This time from one of Melissa's closest friends, Karen. Ryan, Melissa's falling apart. She says you won't even let her explain. Can you just talk to her? For closure? I stared at the message for a while, my mind replaying the events of the past week. Melissa's explanations wouldn't change what she'd done. Closure? That wasn't something I owed her. It was something I was creating for myself. I didn't respond. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the quiet of the house pressing around me. The calls and messages would keep coming for a while. I knew that. But eventually, the ripple effect would fade, leaving only the truth behind. And the truth was this: Melissa and I were over. No amount of talking, pleading, or interference would change that. A few days later, just as I thought things were settling down, I got another unexpected visitor. This time, it was Emma. She stood at my doorstep, calm but determined, holding a folder in one hand and a strained expression on her face. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. We sat at the dining table, where she placed the folder between us. "I know you didn't ask for more," she began, her voice steady but tinged with resolve, "but I thought you'd want to see this." She opened the folder to reveal more evidence: printouts of hotel receipts, screenshots of messages, and even photos from their clandestine meetups. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to look. Each piece of evidence felt like another layer of betrayal peeled back, exposing the depth of their lies. "I've started divorce proceedings," Emma said. "Trevor's trying to play the victim, claiming he was confused and didn't know what he wanted. But this," she gestured to the folder, "this shows exactly what he wanted. And he's going to pay for it." I nodded, closing the folder. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Trevor deserves everything coming to him." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And Melissa?" I exhaled. "She's out of my life. I've made that clear." Emma studied me for a moment. "You're handling this better than I did at first. I spent days crying, smashing things, yelling at him. But now," her eyes hardened, "now, I'm done being the victim." Her determination was palpable, and I couldn't help but admire her strength. "If you need anything, support, a witness, anything, you can count on me," I offered. Her expression softened. "Thank you. Same goes for you." We sat in silence for a moment before she stood, ready to leave. At the door, she turned back. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "it's funny. We're both losing people we thought we could trust, but I don't feel like I've lost anything worth keeping." Her words lingered after she left, settling into the quiet of the house. She was right. Melissa and Trevor had taken themselves out of our lives. What remained now was the task of rebuilding, free of their shadows. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of optimism. My world wasn't ending, it was beginning again, and this time, it was on my terms. The morning after Emma's visit, I woke up early, the kind of early that felt unburdened. The house was silent, but it no longer felt empty. For the first time, it felt like mine. I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the sunlight spill over the neighborhood. There was no longer a weight pressing on my chest, no need to brace myself for what Melissa might say or do next. It was just quiet. Later, I decided to step out of the house for the first time in days. I headed to the hardware store, not for any specific reason but because the idea of starting a new project seemed right. As I wandered the aisles, I realized I wasn't looking for tools. I was looking for purpose, for the next thing to rebuild now that my life was my own. I ended up buying a few things for the garden, an area Melissa had always wanted to spruce up but never followed through on. Back home, I spent the afternoon clearing weeds, turning soil, and planting flowers. My hands ached and sweat dripped down my back, but with every shovel of dirt, I felt like I was reclaiming something. My home, my time, my energy. Neighbors occasionally walked by, some giving me friendly waves, others sneaking glances that carried quiet curiosity. I could feel the whispers already making their way around. They'd noticed Melissa's absence, and no doubt, people were speculating. But I didn't care. As the sun dipped lower, I stood back to admire my work. The small patch of garden wasn't much yet, but it was a start. It was something new, something growing. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself. A simple meal, nothing fancy. The act of preparing it, eating it alone at the dining table, felt strangely satisfying. Melissa had always been the one to fill the silence with her stories, her plans. Now I was learning to sit with it, to let it be. After dinner, I opened a book I hadn't touched in months and read until the words blurred on the page. When I finally turned out the lights, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, not with dread or worry but with calm. It wasn't a perfect day. It wasn't a grand revelation, but it was the first glimpse of what freedom could feel like. And for now, that was enough. The night felt unusually heavy, like the air in the house carried the weight of things left unsaid. I wasn't restless exactly, but something pushed me to keep moving, to sort through the things I'd been avoiding. In the office, I found myself rummaging through an old cabinet when my hand brushed against the edge of a forgotten photo album. It was wedged at the back, its leather cover creased from years of neglect. I paused, staring at it for a long moment before pulling it free. I knew what it was before I opened it. The weight of its significance was impossible to ignore. Sitting at the desk, I flipped through the pages. Each photo felt like a snapshot of another lifetime. There we were on our wedding day, Melissa looking radiant in her lace gown, holding my hand as if the world revolved around us. Another page showed us in Greece, laughing as the wind tousled her hair, our smiles wide and unguarded. The photos told a story I hadn't thought about in weeks. The story of us, back when we were something worth believing in. I paused on one picture, taken at a summer barbecue. Melissa leaned into me, her eyes sparkling with the kind of love that didn't need words. The memories flooded back, vivid and sharp. That day had been one of the last truly happy ones, before work trips and late nights began creeping into our lives, before Trevor's name entered conversations she insisted were innocent. I felt the anger rise, uninvited, but it didn't stay long. The photos weren't lies. They were real, evidence of a connection that once existed. But they were also reminders of what was lost. I closed the album and set it aside, unsure if it belonged in my future or if it should remain in the past where it now felt at home. The next morning, clarity replaced the heaviness. Holding on to these fragments of what once was wouldn't change what had happened. Melissa's choices had closed this chapter, and I couldn't keep reopening it. By midday, I threw myself into more changes around the house. I rearranged the furniture, replaced decor Melissa had picked out, and even moved a few things to storage. The house felt lighter with every change, less like a shared space and more like my own. By nightfall, the photo album still sat on the desk in the office, untouched. It didn't weigh on me the same way anymore. Maybe I'd keep it. Maybe I wouldn't. But I no longer needed it to remind me of what I'd lost, or of what I'd gained by letting go. As I climbed into bed that night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I thought not of the past but of what lay ahead. The freedom was startling, and it was mine. The week had unfolded slowly, each day like a blank page I wasn't quite sure how to fill. By now, the silence of the house had stopped feeling like a reminder of what was gone. Instead, it felt like an invitation, an open space waiting for something new. On a quiet evening, I was unloading groceries when I spotted a familiar figure leaning against a car in my driveway. Emma. She waved when she saw me notice her, her expression hesitant but warm. Didn't expect to see you here, I said as I walked over. Hope you don't mind, she replied. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. Her casual tone didn't quite match the folder she was holding. Come in, I offered, leading her to the kitchen. She sat at the table, placing the folder in front of her but not opening it right away. Instead, her eyes swept over the room, pausing on the flowers visible through the back window. You've made some changes, she said with a small smile. Needed to, I said simply, setting the groceries on the counter. Emma tapped the folder lightly. I brought this for you, she said. It's everything I've gathered for the divorce. Proof, paperwork, The works. Just in case you need it. I hesitated, looking at the folder but not reaching for it. Thanks, but I'm not sure I do. Melissa's out, and that's what matters now. She nodded, folding her hands. I get that. Honestly, I wasn't sure why I brought it. Maybe I just wanted to feel like we're both taking control, in our own way. Her words struck a chord. I sat down across from her, leaning back in my chair. It's hard, isn't it? Trying to take back something they spent so long tearing down. Emma's expression softened, and she exhaled a laugh. Harder than I thought it'd be. But, seeing how you're handling things, it's kind of reassuring. Like it's possible to get through this without falling apart. I smiled faintly. Some days it feels that way. Other days, it's just about keeping one foot in front of the other. She glanced back at the flowers outside. They're nice. New? I nodded. Needed to change the view. They suit you, she said, her voice lighter now. Sometimes, a new perspective is all you need. She stood to leave a short while later, her tone sincere as she said, "Thanks for letting me stop by. It helps knowing someone else is figuring it out." "Anytime," I replied. As Emma drove away, I lingered in the doorway, watching the streetlights reflect off her car. The house behind me felt different somehow, warmer, lighter. Maybe, I realized, the silence wasn't just an absence. Maybe it was the start of something I hadn't been able to see before. Something new. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to take on a new rhythm. The constant buzz of texts and calls had quieted. Melissa's attempts to reach me had dwindled, and with them, so had the ripple effect of her actions. I focused on rebuilding, not just the house but myself. I started running again, an old habit I'd let slip during the chaos of the last year. Early mornings, when the air was still crisp, became my favorite time to clear my head. The steady rhythm of my feet against the pavement felt grounding, almost meditative. One Saturday, after a long run, I decided to revisit a local park I hadn't been to in years. It was quiet when I arrived, the sun just starting to rise over the tree line. Families would arrive later, but for now, it was just me and the occasional jogger. As I walked along the path, I passed by a bench where Melissa and I had once sat years ago. Back then, we'd come here often, bringing coffee, talking about plans for the future. I paused for a moment, letting the memory surface before pushing it aside. Those plans belonged to another life. Further along the trail, I found a new bench, this one overlooking a small pond. I sat there for a while, letting the stillness settle around me. When I finally stood to leave, I felt lighter, as though I'd left a piece of that old life behind. Back at home, I threw myself into more changes. The living room, once filled with furniture Melissa had picked, was now a reflection of my taste. Darker tones, simpler lines. I moved the wedding photo from the mantel to the storage closet. It wasn't an act of anger but of acceptance. That chapter was over. By evening, the house felt truly mine for the first time. I cooked dinner, something simple but satisfying, and ate in the quiet, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the dishwasher. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I hadn't thought of Melissa at all during the day. Not in anger, not in regret. Just not at all. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The shift had begun, and for the first time, I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward. A month had passed since Melissa walked out of my life, and with each passing day, the weight of her betrayal lessened. The world seemed brighter, more open, as if a fog had lifted. I'd made the house my own, tackled projects that had lingered too long, and rekindled old hobbies I'd forgotten I enjoyed. My runs had become longer, my evenings quieter but peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt in control. One Friday evening, as I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, a familiar face appeared. Emma. She was walking her dog, a cheerful golden retriever who wagged his tail as he bounded up the driveway. "Evening," she called, her smile easy. "Evening," I replied, setting my cup down as she approached. "Thought I'd take a different route today," she said, giving the dog a pat. "Glad you did," I said. "He seems to like it here." She laughed. "He likes anyone who'll pay attention to him." We talked for a while, about her dog, the weather, anything but the mess that had brought us together. It felt natural, unforced, and when she left, I realized I was smiling. As the days went on, we ran into each other more often, exchanging casual hellos and quick conversations. One evening, she stopped by with fresh cookies, claiming she'd made too many. I suspected otherwise, but I didn't mind. We sat on the porch again, the sun setting behind the houses. "How's everything going with Trevor?" I asked, breaking the quiet. "Finalized last week," she said, her tone even. "It feels good. Like I can finally move forward." "Same here," I said. She looked at me, her expression soft. "You seem lighter," she said. "Happier." "I think I am," I admitted. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet stretching between us. But it wasn't heavy or awkward, it was comfortable. When she stood to leave, she hesitated at the steps. "Ryan," she said, her voice gentle, "if you ever want to talk, or just have a walking buddy, you know where to find me." I nodded, smiling. "Thanks, Emma. Same goes for you." As she walked away, the dog trotting happily beside her, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. Life wasn't perfect, and the scars of what had happened would always remain. But they no longer defined me. The future was a blank slate, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to step into it. I sat back on the porch, the coffee long forgotten, and watched the stars appear one by one in the sky. A new chapter had begun, and it was mine to write.